And I am very, very pleased to be able to join you online to talk about one of my favourite things, which is how to celebrate a medieval Christmas. I've called it Festive, Fun and Frolics this evening, because as Jean kindly said, I spent many years at the University of East Anglia researching into what I called the festive culture of the east of England, but really how medieval people enjoyed themselves. My argument was that although people worked incredibly hard in the medieval period, and in the eastern side of the country it was all about agriculture, they certainly knew how to let their hair down and enjoy themselves and have a good time. And I am delighted that Jean mentioned church ales, because that's what cropped up time and again in the documents I was researching. This idea of lots of drinking, lots of letting your hair down, partying, and basically enjoying a convivial company. And there was no better time for this than the 12 days of Christmas, the official holiday from work for ordinary everyday people between Christmas Day and Epiphany. And that's what I'd like to share with you tonight. And I am looking at ordinary people, ordinary everyday people. I will mention maybe twice the court and what was going on at the highest levels of society at the time. But what I was really interested in my own research was ordinary people and how they did it. So that's what I would like to look at tonight. So we're going to talk a lot about food and a lot about drink, a lot about singing and dancing. And I am going to indulge myself slightly at the end of the talk by mentioning medieval plays, because as Jean may remember, I love medieval drama. It's my real thing, my real love in life. And Christmas was a great time for the performance of plays. So we will touch on a bit of that this evening. And all of the evidence that I'm going to show you this evening comes from the 14th, 15th and early 16th centuries, before Henry VIII decided to break the Church of England away from the Roman Catholic Church and dissolved the monasteries and basically completely transformed a way of life in England. It's really that period in the middle of the 16th century when everything changes. We're going to look at things that happened, traditional ways of celebrating before the Reformations come about. So that's the time period we're going to look at. So one of the things that I think it's important to remember when we start thinking about Christmas is what's happened just before, because the period of Advent, which we still recognise today, whether it be, you know, observance at church, or in my case, the latest Lego Friends Advent calendar, which ends up all over the lounge floor and I stand on it. Most people still mark the days in December before Advent. And that was a period of serious observation in the Middle Ages. And like Lent, as well as a lot of religious observance, it was a time of fasting. So by the time we get to Christmas, most people have had quite a deprived lifestyle for the 4 weeks leading up to it. It's, you know, as like Lent, it's seen as a time of penitence. And people have begun to feel sort of the deprivations of food at this time anyway. They've had their strong period of harvest, and the foodstuffs are running low. And you get lots of people writing about this. And for wealthy people, it appears that, you know, that means having soups and stews and fish instead of their usual roast meats. But the kind of people we're thinking about today would have been used to a limited diet anyway, but it becomes even more limited over Advent. And we get a 15th century poet who complains that he can eat no puddings nor sauce, but stinking fish not worth a louse. So that's the kind of food that ordinary people are having. And Christmas Eve would have been the heaviest day of restrictions, where any type of animal product would have been prohibited. So people are really, really ready for a good meal when Christmas Day arrives. But to take their minds off their empty tummies on Christmas Eve, one tradition that does take place is decorations. Much like we decorate our houses, that was going on in the Middle Ages as well. But records suggest that it is greenery that is used. Churches were decorated as well as houses. But if you were to go away and, you know, survey all the records that are available, you would think that, oh no, it's only town churches, and I think St Peter's in Northampton would be included in this, that seem to be decorated at Christmas. Because rural churches tend not to mention Christmas decorations. Now, the reason for this is if you live in a nice rural countryside church, you can just send out your church wardens to help themselves from the hedgerows and the fields and whatever is available. Urban churches, they have to pay somebody to do this. And so many of our records for entertainment are financial, things that are being paid for. So you do get the idea that rural churches aren't decorating, but that's not the case, they would be. And holly and ivy seem to be the most popular types of greenery used for decorations. And I always like to show this wonderful page of illuminated manuscript. This is French. It's the 15th century Les Belles de the Duc de Berry from France. This is a book of hours. And this is particularly based around Advent and the Christmas season. We've got this wonderful illustration of the angels announcing the birth of Jesus to the shepherds. And you can see that they're heavily emphasized in the picture because of their size. But what I really like you to look at is all the way around the edges. This wonderful illumination here, absolutely crammed full of ivy, really emphasizing how important ivy is to the season. And we can even find out exactly how holly and ivy are used in medieval decorations. And there's this little poem which says, "Holly stood in the hall, fair to behold. Ivy stood without the door, she full saw a cold." So the tradition would be that you would decorate the outside of your doorway. As people arrived at your home, they would see ivy. But once they stepped through the door into the home, there would be lots and lots of holly decorating the hallway. And also, this is something which tends to get forgotten, herbs would be used as well. So bay and cypress and rosemary were very popular for decorations. And I always think that as well as stepping into a room lit by candles and firelights, which would catch that deep green of the holly, you would also get these wonderful scents of the herbs as the room warms up as well. So as much about smell as it is about sight for decorations in the medieval period. I have yet to come across any reference to mistletoe in Christmas decorations. It appears no church wardens are paying, no private households are paying for mistletoe. As far as I know, this is nothing to do with the fact that it may or may not have, you know, pagan connections. It's just that nobody's paying out for it. When it becomes connected with pagan beliefs, I'm not sure, but it is striking that it's not mentioned in any accounts for decorations. So you ignore the fact you're hungry on Christmas Eve, you decorate your households, you may well go and decorate the parish church. Christmas Day itself, for everybody, would begin very early. Everybody would be expected to get up and go to church for the first mass of the day, which would take place before sunrise. And one of the reasons for this is that the church would be ablaze with candlelight. And the idea was that as people walked towards the church to attend Mass, they would see the light coming out of the stained glass windows, which was there to imply that Jesus had arrived into the world as the light of the world. So he would walk towards the light. And the Mass would contain lots of references to the genealogy of Christ and that kind of thing. But I am sure that most people were actually spending that time looking forward to what was going to happen next, because as soon as they left church in the morning, it would be time for the first proper feast for the last month. And it does appear that feasts and banquets on Christmas Day were something exceptional. And here we have got an illumination from the Norwich School of illumination in the 14th century, highly respected across Europe. You can always tell the Norwich School because they haven't quite yet learned how to do hands or fingers, and they do seem to be slightly alien and bendy, the fingers in the Norwich School works. And this, of course, is showing a feast at the highest level in the court. We've got the king and the queen hosting, they're sitting at the top table, and they've got entertainment, and they've got servants serving them. Christmas feasts at the court were something incredible. If you go to the royal accounts, you'll discover that Richard II was reputed to have had 10,000 guests at one of his Christmas feasts, and they were served with 200 oxen and drunk 200 tubs of wine between them. Henry V, if we go a few years later, the menu for one of his Christmas feasts include dates with mottled cream, carp, prawns, turbot, tench, perch, fresh sturgeon with whelks, roasted porpoise, crayfish, roasted eels and lampreys, and many different types of roasted meats with their garnishes. And we're not told anything about any sweet dishes that were told, apart from marzipan. That's the one thing that creeps onto the menu that's made of sugar. But those are exceptional, and there not too many people in the country would have enjoyed Christmas feasts quite like that. Most people, most ordinary everyday people would have enjoyed a Christmas feast, but it would have been slightly different. And we do know that nearly everybody would have felt entitled to enjoy a Christmas feast, no matter what sort of level of society they were at. And in the east of England, which is the area I was particularly interested in, the vast majority of people would have been in some kind of service to a manorial lord. And we find documents like this. This is a tiny extract from what is called a customal. And a customal is a medieval document which lists all of the tenants on a manor and what land holdings they work for their lord, and what they pay in order to farm this land. And this could be a monetary payment, and it will also be the types of work they do on the lord's land as payment to farm their own land as well. And all of these documents are written in codes. They're written in medieval Latin shorthand. And if I were to transcribe this extract to you into Latin, that's what it would say. If I take it into modern English, we find that we are dealing with a man called Robert Holderlin, who is the tenant of a tiny little manor right in the centre of Suffolk called Harleston. And he is paying sixpence twice a year to his lord of the manor. And we are also told that the same Robert owes at Christmas 4 hens and 2 cockerels, 2 capons and 20 eggs, and shall have food. And it's that phrase, habebit cibum, that's really important, because what we have here is this expectation that Robert and his family on Christmas Day, or it could be New Year's Day, we're talking about the 12 days of Christmas here, at some point during the 12 days of Christmas, he will go to the manor house with his hens and his cockerels and his capons and his eggs. And his family will present themselves to the steward or the bailiff of the manor, who will tick them off the list and relieve them of this livestock and these eggs. And then they will be invited into the Great Hall, where the Lord of the Manor will provide them with a big Christmas feast. And this is absolutely the expectation all the way through the Middle Ages, that a good Lord of the Manor takes care of his tenants, and as well as treating them fairly whilst they work on the land, he will provide this sort of time of jollity and entertainment and good food. And you get, later you'll get writers on husbandry who will mention this. He says, this is Thomas Tusser, early 16th century husbandry expert from Manningtree. And he said, at Christmas we banquet the rich with the poor, who then but the miser but openeth his door. This huge expectation that those who can will provide for those who are struggling. And therefore the Lord of the Manor will provide for his tenants at Christmas. And you can imagine scenes like this one, where you have got the Lord of the Manor and the Lady of the Manor and specially invited guests sitting at the top table. Here the tenants have really enjoyed themselves and have drunk plenty of ale and have fallen asleep on the floor. And I always like to point out that the time we're looking at, of course, they're no longer cooking in the Great Hall. They've discovered that it's much safer to put the kitchen outside in a different building. But very much the Lord of the Lady of the Manor at their top table, overseeing a feast to which all of their tenants and the tenants' families have been invited. And there are still records that tell us more about these feasts at which ordinary people will attend. And we're very lucky here in East Anglia to have a set of records surviving from the Manor of Acton, which was, which still is near Sudbury, and owned and run for about 50 years by a lady called Lady Alice de Brian. She's an incredible lady, Lady Alice de Brian. She is the daughter of one of Edward III, King Edward III's Garter Knights. And like all young girls of her status, she is married off at the age of 14 and has two daughters pretty much straight away. At the age of 26, she is widowed. Her daughters have already been betrothed, so her husband leaves her all of his manors. He's got a lot in the West Country and he's got a lot in East Anglia as well. And despite pressure from the king to get remarried, because she is a very eligible widow, Lady Alice says, no, I'm not getting remarried. I'm going to run all of my estates myself. And that's what she does. She lives into her 80s and she never ever remarries, and she runs the estates herself with help, I will say. She's not doing all of the she's not the boots on the ground doing all the hard work, but she is not remarrying and giving all of this over to another man to run. And her account book survives. And we know what she was doing for Christmas in the year 1412. So in Acton in 1412, Christmas Day was a Sunday, and it was quite an intimate household celebration. So Dame Alice was there with her scribe, her bailiff and her harvest reeve, who are the men that run the manors for her, 16 other household members, and a specially invited guest, a close friend of Lady Alice's called Agnes White. And they were eating a quarter of beef, a quarter of bacon, a pig, a capon and a coney. So a capon is a chicken which has been fattened for the table, and a coney is a rabbit which has been fattened for the table. And we are told that they drink wine and ale. Now, the biggest celebration in Acton took place on New Year's Day, a week later, and over the course of the week, more guests arrived. And on New Year's Day, Dame Alice oversees a feast, which includes her entire household, 36 guests, including members of the local gentry, 2 friars, 300 of her tenants and their families, and various other strangers. We're not told who they are, they're just other strangers. And the menu includes 314 white loaves, so that's the best quality bread, 40 black loaves, which are more like the granary that we're used to today, 2 pigs, 2 swans, 2 joints of meat, 24 capons, 17 conies, and barrels of wine and ale. So Lady Alice is clearly taking this obligation to provide for her tenants at Christmas very, very seriously, and they are really, really enjoying a wonderful feast. So food is clearly an important part of medieval Christmas celebrations. And I struggled to find a medieval picture of beef cattle. So I'm afraid we've got one from, we've got one from November, a calendar of hours from November, when these poor beef cattle are being rounded up, because the last day for slaughtering animals was Martinmas at the beginning of November. But beef is important. Swans, very, very important. I'm sure we have all seen TV shows or films set in the medieval period. If you imagine, you know, Henry VIII hosting a feast, and a centerpiece of a swan is brought in, looking as it did in real life, where it's been roasted and the skin and the feathers have been placed back on. Anybody who was anybody would have a swan centerpiece for their Christmas feasts. And also, by the end of the period we are looking at, by the beginning of the 16th century, turkeys are being eaten at Christmas. They are, of course, being brought back from the Americas. So they are an incredibly exotic rarity. It's really only the richest of the rich that can afford them, because they are, you know, so rare and exotic. But once they become established on the tables of the rich and wealthy, you know, anybody who has any pretensions to social climbing will look to see if they can afford turkeys as well. So they start to sort of filter their way down through society. But at the end of the medieval period, you would be perhaps eating a taste of turkey at Christmas as well. Other foodstuffs, mince pies. Of course, we've got German mince pies here. You can tell we've got the pretzels hanging up. And also, you know, the European mince pies, because they are circular in shape. In England, we had rectangular mince pies, which of course would have been filled with minced meat, but probably with some dried fruits and spices thrown in as well. So they are the forerunners of today's mince pies. They did have a rather unfortunate colloquial name, which was coffin pies, because of their shape, because they were rectangular. The shape was because it was supposed to represent the manger into which the baby Jesus was placed, but that kind of got forgotten and they did get called coffin pies. Also, plum pottage as well. Now, pottage was the great fuel of ordinary agricultural workers in the Middle Ages. It was the kind of thing that would be placed, you know, in a big cauldron over the fire, and would always be bubbling away. So whatever time somebody came in from working in the fields, they could help themselves to pottage. Whatever was available would be thrown into it. And it was just there as fuel to keep people going. Plum pottage is the Christmas variety of it. This recipe I have here is a Regency recipe, early 19th century, but it hasn't changed from the Middle Ages. So plum pottage, take a leg of beef, boil it till tender in a sufficient quantity of water, add 2 quarts of red wine and 2 quarts of old strong beer. Put to these some cloves, mace and nutmeg, enough to season it, and boil some apples, pared and freed of the cores, in it till tender and break them. And to every quart of liquor, put ½ a pound of currants, picked clean and rubbed with a coarse cloth without washing. Then add a pound of raisins of the sun to a gallon of liquor and ½ a pound of prunes. Take out the beef and the broth or the pottage will be fit for use. So this is something that a lot of people would have enjoyed over the Christmas period. And then slightly more common dishes as well, the frumenty. which comes from the Latin fermentum, which means wheat. And it is basically wheat boiled up with milk, so you get sort of a thick, like rice puddingy texture. But frumenty would have other things added. In this version, we have got raisins, sultana, so dried fruits. Often honey would be placed in to sweeten it, and then spices, maybe some ginger or some nutmeg or some cinnamon as well. And again, that would have been sort of a staple to fill people up. And then drinks, lamb's wool, one of the most popular Christmas drinks. Of course, hot ale would have been very popular. Lamb's wool, the base of that tends to be hot cider. Sometimes it's hot ale, but mostly hot cider. And what makes lamb's wool unique is that eating apples would have been cored and peeled and sliced and then placed into the cider as the cider was warmed. So they would crumble away as the cider warmed, which gave sort of the frothy top of lamb's wool, which gave the drink its name. I mean, again, it might be sweetened with honey and maybe have some ginger added for a kick. Lamb's wool is something that you sometimes come across. If you go to a Christmas market, you might find a stall that serves it. If you do, give it a go, because it is delicious. Unlike plum pottage, which is disgusting, lamb's wool is actually really quite nice. If you ever stumble across somewhere that has it, or you come across a recipe for making it at home, do give it a go, because it is really quite nice. So we have got all sorts of food and drinks that would have been provided for, as we now know, everybody at Christmas. But of course, all of this requires a huge amount of preparation in advance. And even Lady Alice would have spent a lot of time with her cook and her housekeeper and the steward of her household in the months leading up to Christmas, making sure they had everything they needed. And we know a little bit about this from the Paston letters. Now, some of you may have heard of the Paston letters. Some of you, it might be a new term to you. The Pastons were a great family of social climbers from Norfolk in the 15th century. Clement Paston, who's seen as the, should we say, the godfather of the Paston clan, was an ordinary agricultural worker, much like the people we're talking about today. But he saved enough money to send his son away to law school, and his son John became a very, very successful lawyer. He was very talented in the law, and he picked up lots of what we would call today celebrity clients. And so from then on, the Pastons had great aspirations to make their way in society. And the matriarch of the Pastons was Margaret. And Margaret liked nothing better than keeping up with the neighbours and impressing the neighbours. And Christmas was the time in which she could really do this. So she becomes obsessed with making sure everything is organised and ready for Christmas. And the Paston family are most famous for writing many, many, many letters to each other, which have survived. And this is an extract from a letter to Margaret from one of her bailiffs. And he says, "Mistress, it were good to remember your stuff of herring now this fishing time. I have got me a friend in Lowestoft to help me buy 7 or 8 barrel, and they shall not cost me above 6 and 8 a barrel. You shall do more now in the autumn with 40 shillings than you shall at Christmas with 5 marks. So he's saying, right, it's time to buy the herrings now. This is where we're going to get them the cheapest. Let's stock up ready for Christmas. And although Margaret did absolutely love to have the best of the best to impress the neighbours, she wanted it at the best price. She was very, very aware of economy, was Margaret. And she felt that the markets at Norwich were overpriced for the types of things that she would need for her Christmas table. And she writes one year to her son, who's a law student in London, to inquire about the price of certain things in the London markets. And these are mostly exotic ingredients which would need to be imported. And she asks for the prices of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, almond, mace, rice, ginger, saffron, and raisins. And then in another letter, she asks about dates, oranges even, treacle and sugar loaves, all of which she is going to use for various meals over the Christmas period. She then says, send me word what price a pound. If that it be better cheap in London than it is here, I shall send you money to buy such stuff as I will have. And we know from later letters that this was perhaps a little foolhardy on her part, because the same son will later be prosecuted many times over for gambling outside the Inns of Court. So he's not the best person to be sending this money to. But anyway, Margaret is really interested in getting all of these exotic ingredients for the best price. I always think sugar loaves are very interesting, because we do have this belief, I think, that only the highest in society would have enjoyed sugar during the Middle Ages, and that's not the case. Margaret is buying several sugar loaves each year. Those are big conical items, which are probably about 4 or 5 feet high, about 3 foot in diameter. Sugar is being grown at this time in the Holy Land. It's being grown as cane, and it's imported across the Mediterranean and up through Italy and across to the Low Countries. When then it's brought into London, it's refined, I believe, in Holland, and then it's brought as these sugar loaves across to England. And the sugar loaves would have been broken up with these vicious-looking sugar nips, and then either served as lumps, and many people did enjoy just a sugar lump for a quick, sweet hit. But mostly what would have happened was it would have been ground down in a pestle and mortar, and then used for various different recipes, all of which we know would have been served at Christmas feasts. And we know from Dame Alice's records that everybody who came to her feasts would have been offered some of these sweetmeats. So even, you know, the people at the lowest levels of society would have enjoyed some sugary treats at Christmas time. So we know sugar is important, as well as the exotic ingredients. But as I have said, swans also incredibly important. So much so that over here in the east of England, swans were quite an important part of the economy. And they were very much sort of owned by the Crown, but the Crown leases out swanneries to various different people in return for quite a high sum of money. Every once a year there would have been the swan upping, at which flocks of swans would have been gathered up and checked for their health. And then they would have also been those young swans who had been born during the year would have been branded, and that's what we have got here on this swan roll from Broadland, Norfolk. These beautiful pictures of swans with massive beaks, so you can see their marks, the brands that have been put onto their beaks. And over the top of each of these marks is the name of those people or groups of people who have been granted a license to farm the swans from the Crown. And in this we have got people like the Bishop of Norwich. He has got his own set of swans. Sir William Boleyn of Blickley, who's an ancestor of Anne Boleyn. The Mayor of Norwich has also been given a license to farm swans. And intriguingly, 3 Norwich parish churches have been granted a license as well. I should imagine that they are doing it in order to sell the swans, because those who do not have their own swannery license will still be requiring swans for their feast. And there is this great economy in swans. I have found records of one landowner in Suffolk and Norfolk who has dreadful problems with his rabbits, and they keep escaping into his neighbours' fields and destroying the crops. And to apologise, he is continually giving presents of swans from his swannery. So there is this great trade in swans, and you do need to have one at your Christmas feast. So lots and lots and lots of food, lots and lots of drink, but also at these Christmas feasts, we know there would have been plenty of entertainment as well. Many of these feasts would have been multiple courses long, 10, 12, 14 courses. That's a lot of food for people to cope with. So after every couple of courses, there would have been an interlude of entertainment to allow people to digest and get ready for the next course. And again, we can turn to records to find out who is being paid to provide the entertainment. And at Dame Alice's feasts, we have a harper. Now, Dame Alice did not keep her own musicians, but we believe this musician came from the local castle, Clare Castle, where he was the resident musician. But the Earl of Lancaster was not in residence, so the harper was lent out to Dame Alice for the Christmas period. And it's likely that the harper would have been forming several what we call guests. And with these, you have to imagine the great sort of Saxon sagas of Beowulf, which are these stories of great action and daring do and heroics, which would have kind of been performed and acted out by the storyteller. The harper is doing something very similar, but he's adding music into it as well, and telling stories of great heroics and great feats, of bravery and romances and that kind of thing. One of the most famous, most popular is the Song of Roland, which tells of the exploits of the great Christian general of Charlemagne's armies, taking on the Muslims during the Crusades. My favourite is a French one, which is called Paris la Duchesse, which tells the story of the wife of the King of France. And the King of France comes to suspect that the very healthy son they have together is not his. So he casts the boy and his mother out. And the guest is all about the adventures and trials they go through, and how she's an incredibly capable and clever lady who ensures that they survive on all these amazing adventures. And eventually it turns out that her son is actually the heir to the throne of Hungary. So by the end of the guest, he has become the King of Hungary, and she is up there as the Queen, the King's mother. And so that's a sort of a lovely one, but about ladies rather than, you know, generals or soldiers or something like that as well. So we've got harpers performing their guests. And of course, there would have been homegrown entertainment as well. There would have been plenty of singing and dancing. And then, of course, Christmas carols would have been sung. Now, carols are interesting because they don't start out with any connection at all with Christmas. It comes from the French word, which really means a song to be sung to accompany dancing, particularly circle dancing, which is really popular in the Middle Ages. But by the 15th century, this style of song, which is usually defined as being a repeated chorus followed by a verse, becomes particularly associated with Christmas. And the earliest ones are more like prayers, like this one, St. Godric's Vision. So in my best, or my worst Middle English, Sancta Nicolae Scods Drude, timbre us fair Schoonapus, at the birth at thy bier, Sancta Nicolae bring us well there. So St. Nicholas, God's darling, graciously prepare us for beautiful dwellings. At the birth at thy bier, St. Nicholas bring us safely there. So much more like a prayer about talking about going to heaven and that kind of thing. But then they change a little bit more and we get things like the shepherd. So the shepherd upon a hill he sat, he had on him his tabard and his hat, his tabor, his pipe and his flageolet. His name was called Jolly Jolly Wat, for he was a good herd's boy. Ut-hoy! For in his pipe he made so much joy. So we get sort of much more jolly, upbeat songs. And then, of course, there are the medieval carols like the Holly and the Ivy, which has survived down to us today still. And a lot of medieval carols are great staples for the choirs, church choirs and that kind of thing. I'm going to treat myself now by playing one of my favourites, which I'm sure you will recognise. Just one thing, I've turned up the volume almost as much as I can on my computer. You might like to adjust the volume on your own if you can't quite hear it. But here we go, Medieval Carol. And then in that proper medieval carol style, we've got the Gaudete refrain, which returns in between each of the verses. But the songs that would have been sung didn't always have deeply religious lyrics. There were also quite a lot of songs about the fun of eating and drinking too much and enjoying oneself too much at Christmas as well. I'm going to play you another one, another Christmas song now, I'm going to call it. Which would have been very, very popular. All sorts of people would have sung this. I particularly like this one because we think that one of the very earliest written records we have for this song, which is called Bring Us In Good Ale, may have come from Ipswich. I can't prove it, but like many big towns, and I'm sure Northampton was the same, Ipswich had a group of minstrels known as waits, they were night watchmen as part of their job, but they also performed the music at borough feasts. And in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Ipswich Waits or the Ipswich Minstrels book still survives. And they have the lyrics for Bring Us In Good Ale written down that. It's a late 15th century. So it might be the earliest written record. But let me play you a little bit of Bring Us In Good Ale.
Bread, for that is made of bran. No, bring us in no white bread, for therein it is no gain.
Bring us in no beef, for there is many bones. But bring us in good ale, for that goes down at once.
Oh, bring us in good ale, bring us in good ale. For our blessed Lady's sake, bring us in good ale. Bring us in no bacon, for that is passing fat. But bring us in good ale and give us enough of that.
Bring us in no mutton, for that is often lean. No, bring us in no tripes, for they be seldom clean.
Oh, bring us in good ale, good ale.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I moved my finger. I shouldn't have done that. But hopefully that gave you a taste of Bring Us In Good Ale. So he has some proper religious carols and sort of a bit more of a cheery song about eating and drinking as well. So all these types of things would have been entertainment for Christmas feasts. And many households also may have elected a Lord of Misrule for the 12 days of Christmas as well. Now, this could be anybody. It's usually a younger person, but it could be a member of the family, or it could be a servant. And they would be in charge for the Christmas period. You sometimes come across them as kings of Christmas as well. And one of their most important jobs was to organise all of the different entertainments. And there was a worry that these lords of misrule, as the name suggests, did get a little bit out of hand. And we do have some records from the 16th century where the Bishop of Norwich actually bans lords of misrule. Because he was worried that they might burst into church unreverently, playing their lewd parts with scoffing, jesting, or ribaldry talk. So he says no more laws of misrule in this diocese. But they were an essential part of Christmas. And one of the entertainments they may have organised over the 12 days was mumming, or a visitation by mummers. And here we have got a wonderful, wonderful illustration, again from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, of some mummers. And as this illustration here suggests, the essential thing about mummers were they were in disguise. And here we've got somebody dressed as, I think, a stag and a boar, and somebody else dressed up as a rabbit. And mummers would make visitations to households, usually at night. And they would come in disguise and they would present gifts. And they might dance and gamble and play games with the members of the household. And all the time, the household members had to guess who was underneath the disguises. And it was all based around gift giving, which in the Middle Ages was always done on New Year's Day, not Christmas Day. Gift giving was a New Year's thing. And it was incredibly popular. It was very popular at the court. King Richard II loved mumming, and we have records of him in 1377, 130 men dressed up in disguises and went a-mumming, and they rode from Westminster to Kennington Palace, where the young King Richard was living at the time. And they presented gifts to the king, and as I said, they had dances and they played certain games, and he had to guess who they all were. Unfortunately, mumming did pick up a bit of a reputation, particularly at these levels, because you can imagine the security nightmare of having 130 people turning up to the young king at Kennington Palace in disguise. And we know that several assassination attempts were made on various different medieval kings under the colour of mumming, because it allowed people to get into the royal presence in disguise. But it was generally very much an entertainment which was continually enjoyed. But it becomes something that gets developed, and it's developed by somebody from East Anglia, a monk from East Anglia called John Lydgate, who was a monk at Bury St Edmunds in the 15th century. Lydgate liked nothing better than spending the Christmas season with the great and the good of the land. And he was often to be found either at the royal court or with various noble households, or as guests of the goldsmiths of London and that kind of thing, which you might think strange. He's a monk from Bury St Edmunds, and why is he there? The reason is that Lydgate was a poet. But also he was an early playwright, and we have surviving from him several scripts for evening entertainments, indoor evening entertainments, which he writes specifically for his sponsors, these members of the nobility and the royal court. And they are all mummings, but for the first time, these mummings have scripts. And the idea is that the household will gather round in the Great Hall, and the mummers will come on one by one, and they will be presented to the household by the narrator. The narrator, or the expositor as he is known, is the only person who speaks. The rest of the cast stay silent, and of course, the word mum is synonymous with silence. You keep mum about things. And the narrator introduces each of the characters. But in Lydgate's mummings, not only are the characters introduced, but they are somehow involved in a moral quandary. There's something not quite right amongst this cast of characters. And a moral problem is presented to the audience. And once this is all done, the audience then spend the rest of the evening debating this problem and trying to come up with a solution. It's sort of it's often known as debate d'amour, and Chaucer's poetry, like the Parliament of Fowls, is very similar, where he presents in his poem this moral problem which his audience then discuss for the rest of the evening's entertainment. And Lydgate is doing something very similar. Now, a lot of his mummies have, classical allegorical figures as their cast. So here's the introduction to one of them, which is called A Mummy for the Goldsmiths of London. And it says, lo, here follows the device of a disguising before the great estates of this land, then being at London, made by Lydgate John, the monk of Bury, of Dame Fortune, Dame Prudence, Dame Righteousness, and Dame Fortitude. Behold, for it is moral, pleasant, and notable. Lo, first comes in Dame Fortune. And these characters come onto stage and are presented by the narrator. And the problem that has to be discussed is, how do you combat the fickleness of fortune? So this great medieval idea of the wheel of fortune. So sometimes you're at the top, sometimes you're at the bottom. And the audience have to come up with ideas of how can you always be at the top of the wheel of fortune. But then Lydgate goes on to do something even more different and quite groundbreaking with his mummies, where he leaves behind these allegorical characters, which are so popular in literature at the time. He leaves behind religious figures. He goes for ordinary people. And he writes one which is called A Mumming at Hertford. And this is specifically written for the young King Henry VI, who is still a boy, and his mother, Queen Catherine, who live at Hertford Castle. And in this mumming, the characters that are brought on, first we get a set of men who are ordinary agricultural workers, the kind of people we've been talking about all evening. And they are brought on, and they come on and they complain heartily about the mistreatment they receive from their wives, and how their wives treat them really, really badly. But what's amazing is the wives are then allowed to come on and answer what their husbands have just said. It's a little bit like a court scene, really. And they're allowed to come on and they have their say. And I have to say, their arguments are much stronger than the husbands. And then the end of it, the narrator turns to the young king, and says, my lord, it is now time for you to decide. And basically he's saying, who wears the trousers in the marriage? Is it the husband or is it the wife? And the king has to make a decision about it. There's been lots of sort of study into it that says it's commentary on the place of Queen Catherine Valois at the time, who of course has got her eye on Owen Tudor and will go off and found the Tudor dynasty in a few years' time, and how disastrous that is for the current ruling elite. But it is really interesting that Lydgate has decided to steer away from allegory and religion and to go with ordinary people for his entertainments, which are performed at Christmas time. And I'm beginning to just keeping an eye on the time and realizing I need to come to an end. But I do want to talk about one more play which we think was probably performed at this type of feast that we've been thinking about, hosted by the Lord or the Lady of the Manor, with all of the tenants as guests in the hall. And they've enjoyed a brilliant feast, and now they're going to watch a play. And this is really, really common. You will find it in all sorts of records. This is just a snapshot of the accounts of the Duke of Norfolk for his home in Stoke-by-Nayland. So, item paid on the 3rd of January to 4 players of my Lord of Essex at the commandment of my Lord's grace, 6 shillings and 8pence. So these are travelling players sponsored by the Earl of Essex, because at this point, if you're not sponsored, you can be treated as a vagabond. And they're being invited to come in and perform a play. Really, really common. The Duke of Norfolk's accounts then go on to list some local players, one from Lavenham, some from Billericay, and some from Hadley in Essex. And this is proper Amdram, medieval Amdram, where groups of local people get together to perform a play. In the summer, they will perform it outside. But in the winter season, they will take it to noble households or monastic households and perform in the Great Hall and raise money for church funds, exactly like you're trying to do this evening. And one of the plays that is very popular that is performed at the time is called Mankind. Now, I am sure that some of you have heard of that great 16th century play, Everyman, which is a sort of really a preparation for what happens if you give in to sin and your final days come calling. You know, how are you going to have a good death and get yourself ready to meet your maker, that kind of thing. We've got an East Anglian version of it, which I must say is much, much more jolly, very, very earthy as well. And in the play of Mankind, we have got the Mankind figure. Here we've got a lady Mankind here, who is an ordinary agricultural worker, like everybody you'll find in East Anglia. And what's most important to her is that she spends her life toiling the land and saying her prayers. And she's tempted by 4 vices. We've got new guys, nowadays, mischief, and there's also naught. And what they want to do is tempt mankind away from her good lifestyle. They basically wanted to stop working and they wanted to stop praying. And they do all sorts of things to try and tempt her, but she won't give in. And in the end, they get a bit fed up that they cannot tempt mankind. And then they think, well, what are we going to do? So they decide to conjure up a devil. And this devil is called Titivilus. There he is in all his glory. And Titivilus, very importantly, is invisible to mankind. The audience, of course, can see Titivilus, but mankind cannot see Titivilus. And Titivilus uses his sort of devilish magic to try and tempt mankind. First thing is Titivilus places wooden planks underneath the ground that mankind is trying to dig. But when mankind can't do this, thinks, well, I can't do this right now, so I'm going to stop this and I'm going to go and say my prayers. And Titivilus gets quite annoyed because that's not what he's looking for. So mankind kneels down to say his prayers. And so Titivilus decides to send a call of nature, a desperate call of nature. And anybody who's ever been in that position knows that you can't think about anything else till you've had a wee. So mankind rushes away to relieve himself, and then of course he realizes he's given into temptation. He's not working, he's not saying his prayers, and so he gives up and he thinks, well, I've given in, that's the end. And he decides to join the gang of the vices, and they're going to go marauding around the countryside, pillaging and raping and killing and all those terrible, terrible things. But at the very last minute, the character of Mercy comes in and persuades mankind that, you know, okay, you've given into temptation once, but that's not the end. If you confess your sins, you can start again. And so, you know, mankind does that and therefore defeats the vices and everything ends happily, on a much more upbeat ending, I must say, than Everyman. So that, in a nutshell, is the play that is presented. But it's so cleverly written because it is written for exactly the type of audience we've been talking about today. The Lord, the Lady, with their specially invited guests at one point, and on the other hand, all these ordinary people. It's actually mentioned in the script. The character of Mercy addresses the audience and says, "O ye sovereigns that sit, and ye brethren that stand right up," addressing an audience divided by social status, the Lord and the Lady sitting down at the top table, the tenants standing around the edge of the hall, waiting to watch the show. So it's aware of it, the script is aware of it. And then you've got all kinds of different jokes. Mercy, who is a bit of a garrulous character, makes a lot of very bad jokes, but they're all in Latin. So most of the audience aren't going to get it, but the well-educated and the religious people who are watching it will get the bad jokes in Latin. But then the vices come on and they like nothing better than a fart joke. And they really do. It's very, very earthy language and the things they get up to. Lots of bare bottoms all over the place. So appealing to a completely different set of the audience. And they will do things like parody the types of experience that ordinary people have. Ordinary people would attend the manor court several times a year, where they would hear lots of stuff read out in Latin. They wouldn't understand it. It would be gobbledygook. And in the play, the Vices do that. They use really bad parodied Latin. This is just an example. Here is blottibus in blottis, blottorum blottibus istis. So the kinds of things that people think they hear. So this real awareness of the type of audience that is listening to it as well. So it's clearly a play which is written for a festive season. It's got quite a lot of references to Christmas in it, but for an audience exactly the type of thing that we've been looking at today. Ordinary people who have turned up for a lot of good food, a lot of good drink, hosted by the Lord and the Lady of the Manor. And with that, I think we have definitely, I hope, experienced some festive fun and frolics for Christmas and New Year. Thank you ever so much for listening to me.